What we're going to do is look at the short answer portion of this test. So before I go into it, just so you understand the skills, what's important is that you need to know the makeup of the exam itself. So you're going to start out with multiple choice, 55 questions, multiple choice. Then you're going to do your short answer, 3 short answer questions. Then you're going to have a document-based essay. And then finally, a long essay question. So we're going to focus on the short answer questions today in this video. Okay, so I took notes for you on the short answer section. Now it's titled Short Answer Section 1, Part B, because Section 1 of the AP exam includes your multiple choice and your short answer. So it's Part B because Part A is your 55 multiple choice. So we're going to focus on Part B today. And there are 4 things that you need to know. So the types of questions that are going to be asked of you will require you to analyze a historian's interpretation, historical sources, and propositions about history. So you'll see what I'm talking about. They're going to give like a thesis that a historian gives, and you have to answer questions on it, like support the thesis or refute it, and all that. So sometimes questions provide opportunities for students to explain historical examples that they know best. You will find out exactly what I mean here. You get to use your knowledge of history to best answer the questions by, citing specific examples. Next, some questions include texts, images, graphs, or maps. In the question sample that I'm going to show you, the question will be a text. Students choose between 2 options for the final required SAQ. So really, this is how it's going to work. Really, I want you to pay attention here. So you're going to have one question, question 1. It's required, which means you have to do it. Question 1 is going to cover periods 3 through 6. Could be from any point there. Question 2 is also required and also covers periods 3 through 6. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Your choice. So, you have a choice between question 3 or 4. You only do one. Question 3 covers periods 1 through 3, and question 4 is 4 through 6. Now here, I would choose what you do best at. What question you think you could have a better chance at answering. That's my strategy. And these questions will be based off of, in some cases, historical thinking skills. So they might ask you to compare certain developments in history to others. So let's move on to our example then. Okay, so here is a text. Question 1 is going to be based off of this source. Now I want you to take a screenshot of this using your cell phone, and I want you to read it carefully. Okay? So right off the bat, Rudolph seems to be pretty anti-big government. So whenever we see like totalitarians or like power that's controlled entirely by elites, Rudolph says, hey, what happens? We see murder and war, okay, on foreign, so other countries, and domestic subjects. So war and murder happens to foreigners and people like citizens within its own country, okay? The more constrained the power of governments, the more power is diffused, checked, and balanced. The less it will aggress on others and commit mass violence. So it's kind of like the more power someone has, so more power equals more violent, right? That's kind of what I see. And then the opposite is true. So less power equals less violent, okay? In fact, he uses the words diffused, checked, and balanced. Okay, the more that power is diffused and checked and balanced, the less violence there is. Okay? At the extremes of power, totalitarian. Ooh, they use the word totalitarian. Totalitarian governments slaughter their own people by the tens of millions. So we see the differences between totalitarian and democracies. I kind of attribute that to this. Okay? So the more power governments have, totalitarian governments, the more violent they are. Okay, so that's kind of the general idea of this document. What helps is when you have your test, I would circle the main ideas, just like I did here, so that you could get a better sense of how to do this. All right? So now that we read this and hopefully you have a better understanding of this document, let's answer question 1. Question 1 is going to be broken down into 1, 2, 3 sub-questions. Now the short answer questions do this. I know it's annoying, and I know it reminds you of math. You know how they make you do multiple questions at once. Well, that's what history is. Good news is, you don't have to write a page for every single question. You can answer each one in like 2 to 3 sentences. Now, quick side note on how to answer these. So, the AP exam is going to give you a box on your answer booklet, and each box is going to be titled a question. Now remember, you have 3 questions that you have to answer. 1 and 2 are required, and then the final question is your choice, either 3 or 4. So they're going to give you each a box, okay? And let's say this is the question 1 box. If you write your answer like so, okay, within the box, and then all of a sudden you kind of write outside of the box, the AP exam is going to discount this question and you automatically get it wrong. Why is that? Well, it's because this section is scanned by a computer, and the computer automatically discounts your response if your response is outside the box, because it only scans what's in here. So, always make sure, right? Always make sure that you write within the box and make the grader's life easier when you're doing this. You know how you do it? In the box, when you answer A, B, or C, just write what question you're answering. So if you're going to answer A, you write the answer for A here. B, write it where it says B. C, you write it there. Boom, you're done. Move on. Okay? Question 1, letter A. Let's go. Identify one historical example of mass violence that was committed by a totalitarian state in the 20th century that supports Rommel's argument in the passage. So, if I go back to what the short answer questions require you to do, guess what you're doing here? You're analyzing a historian's interpretation. That historian is Mr. Rudolf Rommel, or whatever his name was. Okay, so you're actually supporting his interpretation. You're trying to find an example of a totalitarian government that did participate in mass violence in the 20th century. You're also doing this. This question is actually giving you the opportunity to explain the historical examples that you know best. You get to choose any act of mass violence from the 20th century that you remember a totalitarian state participating in. That's all you. So you only write about what you know best, okay? And yeah, this question involves a text. So do you see what I mean here? Gives you a broad overview. So let's look at this text here. Yeah, we're looking at a totalitarian government that slaughters tens of millions of people. Do we have at least one example of this? Let's start, and it's opening us to the whole 20th century, so from 1900 to 1999. Anything. So the first thing I think of are the Nazis, right? The Nazis were a totalitarian government. Adolf Hitler was in charge. He had complete control over the Third Reich. Now, another example could be Cambodia, right? Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, the genocide that happened there in the 1970s. Another act of mass violence created by a totalitarian government was Joseph Stalin's de-kulakization, so getting rid of the kulaks and landowners during the 1930s. Many of them were actually sentenced to death or years in labor. So here's a sample response that would work and get the point. One totalitarian state that participated in mass violence during the 20th century was Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Now, to get this right, we need to cite and identify mass violence. This is how we get the point. Hitler participated in mass violence during the Holocaust. Okay, the Holocaust is our example of mass violence. That would get us the point. Now we have to explain one historical example of a democratic state committing mass violence that would challenge Rommel's argument regarding democracies and mass violence. So now we need to come up with one example from our minds during the 20th, well, actually it doesn't say 20th century in this question, but any example of a democratic state participating in mass violence. Guess what? This goes totally against, in fact, it challenges Rommel's argument. So this is what the short answer questions are going to be doing. They're going to see if you are able to look at a thesis and identify it and actually support it with evidence and refute it. So think back, what are some things that democratic states have done in order to, commit violence? I automatically think of imperialism, right? Army Star. During the 20th century, we see colonies in Asia and Africa try to gain independence. And these colonies are ruled by democratic states like Great Britain or the United Kingdom or France. And notice, this is from India. Remember, in India, in the year 1919, when Indians tried to peacefully protest British rule, British soldiers from a democratic state opened fire and killed roughly 1,500 people. Okay, so talk about an example of mass violence. That's what I would put as my answer. You could also include World War II firebombing. Okay, so remember, England and the United States participated in brutal acts of violence, bombing major civilian centers in Germany and Japan. You also have, I would also include the atomic bomb, right? The United States dropping the atomic bomb. The U.S. is a democratic state, and that was an example of mass violence, wasn't it? Because it was targeted against civilian population. So this last one here is a little challenging. It asks you to explain one development in the late 20th century. Late 20th century. So we're talking like, I'd say 70s, 80s, 90s. Okay? So one development in that era that likely shaped Rummel's view of the relationship of democracy and mass violence. Okay, so development is like a trend. What's happening in this time period that might influence our historian's point of view? And what's his point of view with democracy and mass violence? He says that there's not a lot of violence when there's democratic governments in charge. So what's something in the 1990s, 80s that could have happened that influenced this guy's way of thinking? Well, if we look back, this document was created 1994. Ooh, that's pretty interesting. I'm thinking like Cold War. Cold War ended in 1991. So the fall of the Soviet Union. So I would say one development is the fall of the Soviet Union might have influenced Rummel's view, because he kind of has this positive, this very happy view of democracy. This very happy view of democracy, when in the last question, question B, we proved that democratic states are not immune to mass violence. So this is just calling out his bias. And what is the source of this? What development? I would say the victory of democracy over totalitarianism at the end of the Cold War. So the end of the Cold War would be a really good development that explains our author's point of view that democracy seems to be better than totalitarianism, because guess what? They did not have a lot of violence. Okay, so that's what I would say. The Cold War participated in this. You could also say, and what also works, is that in the late 20th century, or after World War II, you see the rise in democratic governments, okay? A liberalization of the political structures in the world after World War II could also explain our guy's democratic bias, okay? So this is where, and I'm going back to here, this is where you're writing about what you know. So think about what you know, and whatever evidence that you remember that best relates to the question, use it. Okay, so really pay attention to all parts of the document to get a sense of what evidence you could remember. And for me, it was as simple as just looking at the year this was created.